Good evening. Feels like it's midnight outside. Also, feels like we're going to have a flood, so hopefully neither of those things are the case. If you want, you can open up to Luke chapter 12. That's where we're going to spend our time together this evening. Luke chapter 12. Over and over again in the Bible, we're told to fear God. We're also told to love God. And over again, we're told, do not fear. So there's a strange tension between those three ideas. And to me, at least, it's the type of tension that it's almost like trying to grab hold of like a bar of soap that's wet and slippery, and it's like the harder you grab at it, the more likely it is to just go flying out of your hand. And that's kind of how this feels to me, because it seems to me that as soon as I feel like I've figured out something along the lines of this tension, something else pops up and complicates it even more than I thought it was complicated originally. And we won't try to solve this whole thing tonight. We're going a different direction. But one thing that I think complicates it is that I don't think we can get rid of this tension by doing what sometimes we do, and that is by massaging the definition of fear to make it, or to reduce it, simply to respect or to reverence or to awe. I think all of those things are involved in this. But there's a reason why the word fear is chosen. There's an element here of something that's bigger than me, something that I can't control, something that I am afraid of. There's something deeply rooted within us, this impulse of fear. Now, in Luke chapter 12, Jesus sits down in this tension. And like what we're going to do tonight, or try to do, he doesn't, I think at least, he doesn't try to solve it, but he does invite us into it. And you can look at the bookends here. So look just in verse 5, and we'll read the whole text as we go through. But he says, "Fear him who, after he is killed, has authority to cast into hell." So fear. Now look at verse 32. "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." So to fear and not to fear. And if you can see the little subtitle at the bottom of this slide, I know sometimes at least my head, yep, right there, my head is in that. I didn't realize that till recently, so yeah, thanks for y'all for not ever telling me that. I'll just preach like this from now on. But yeah, right above where my head is on the slide here, theology and therapy of the Creator God. The theology and therapy in light of the Creator God. Those are the two sides of this that I think are incredibly interesting, because theology is the fancy word for the study of God. It's what we do in this room pretty often, just to study God, study things that have to do about God. And in this text, Jesus gets deeply theological. He is preaching about God, the Creator, the source and sustainer of everything that exists. So he's deeply theological, but he's also surprisingly therapeutic. And when we think of therapy, we think of emotional health, mental health. It comes from the Greek word therapeuo, which just means to heal. So it has to do with healing us especially in our minds, emotionally, mentally. And Jesus also deals with that side of this equation here in Luke chapter 12, because he's concerned about his friends. He's concerned about their well-being, their care, their safety. So he touches on aspects of theology and therapy here in Luke 12 that I think are pretty fascinating. And it all centers around this anxious world as we experience it that is ruled by God. Ruled by a God who is gracious and fearsome at the same time. It's ruled by this God who Jesus calls Father. So what he touches on here is not being a coward who fears what shouldn't be feared, but also not being a fool who doesn't fear what should be feared. It's avoiding both of those things. And I think in the end, he comes to, if we can put it in what I think is a fun way, to say the theology of terror, but also a therapy of tranquility. A theology of terror and a therapy of tranquility. So I hope you'll see that as we go through here in Luke 12. And as we begin, I want to point out that I think we need all of this, all the theology, all the therapy, because we are complicated. So Jesus, here we're going to read in just a second, Jesus talks in this text about birds. Now, birds, when they encounter something that is bigger than them, something that can do them harm, let's just say, I'm not going to pretend to be a bird expert, but let's say that they have the 3 typical reactions that we think of when it comes to fear. That is fight, flight, or freeze. Those are their reactions. So if a plane's coming at them, a bird has to get out of the way. So it's going to fight, flight, or freeze. But the thing about birds is that, as far as I know at least, they're not sitting down with a therapy bird the next week and talking about that experience, right? As soon as it happens, it's kind of done for. The birds have moved on. But we have, I think, most of us have a little bit more brain power. And what that means is a lot of good things, but it also means that we can anticipate those things that are going to happen that will cause us fear, right? In other words, we worry. If we're going to put it negatively, we worry. We have anxiety about the future, about the present, about the past. We worry. So we need this because we are complicated creatures. Now, the way that Jesus confronts this tendency within me, maybe within you, this tendency to worry, and by worrying, I cause myself more trouble than whatever it is I'm worrying about. The way that he confronts that tendency is not just by snapping his fingers and saying, peace be still, and it's just over with. I wish he would just walk on the troubled waters of my soul and say, peace be still. But that's not how he deals with this, at least here. He deals with it by prescribing correct thinking for us. Correct thinking about the way that the world works, the way it has been, the way it will be. Correct thinking about God, to fear him. But then also correct thinking about our world, and that is not to fear. So to fear and not to fear. Not to fear our world, but to fear God. So it's those impulses that Jesus is tugging at here, and I think it's very interesting. Now, the people that he's talking to here, I want you to see the stakes that this holds for them. So look at verse 11 of Luke chapter 12. Jesus says, when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and the authorities, do not be anxious about how you should defend yourself or what you should say. Don't be anxious about how you should defend yourself or what you should say. Now, if you remember what happens to the people that he's talking to in the future, many of them at least are we would say, put on trial for their faith, endure persecution for their faith. So this is real life for them. Jesus is telling them, look, this is going to happen, and if you want to read about it, you can read about it in the 2nd volume of Luke, which is the book of Acts, where we read about persecutions that they endure. So this is real life for them. There are not that many things in the regular human experience that are more anxiety-inducing than being on trial with your life on the line. But that's what's in the future for them, these life and death situations. So the first thing I want us to kind of notice, beginning in verse 4, is that our God is a God of birds and bald spots. Our God is a God of birds and bald spots. So look at verse 4. He says, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more that they can do. So don't fear. He tells them, let go of your fear. But he doesn't just remove the fear, as much as I might want him to do that. He actually redirects it. He moves that fear. He says, don't fear those who can kill the body. But then in verse 5, he says, but I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Now this is a strange way, I think, to help the disciples to feel better, because it's essentially moving them from the frying pan into literal hellfire, right? That's the move here. So it's a strange way to help them to feel better about this. It might not feel like very helpful therapy, but I think part of the point of this, at least part of the point, is that the one with the power to do this, the one that he says, the one who has the power to cast into hell, the one with that power is on your side. Unlike the people who are putting you on trial, the people who can potentially kill the body, the one with this power, a greater power, is for you. And you can see that from what he says in verses 6 and 7. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? And not one of them is forgotten before God. Why, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows. Now, if you're just reading through this, we stopped in the middle of it, but notice, this feels pretty jarring. In verse 5, we're talking about, if we can say it, a terrifying hell dispatcher, right? That's what verse 5 is talking about. And then in verse 6, a winsome bird watcher. It feels like a pretty abrupt shift between those two verses. But I think it's actually less abrupt than it feels, at least on the surface, because having the authority to do something is not the same as doing it, right? Having the authority to do something is not the same as doing it. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at, that the point here is that in these life and death situations in which these disciples are going to find themselves, where their lives are at stake, and even if we can bring this into our lives, in the moments where we have anxiety about things that are far less than life and death, right? In those moments, God is the only one who should be feared. But because of who he is, we don't have to fear him in that same way that we fear those earthly authorities. Because of who he is. Because he is the God of birds and bald spots. Because of how he treats the least significant aspects of our reality, represented here by the sparrows and by hairs on our heads. Because God numbers all of them. None of them are forgotten before him. Because of how he treats them, we can know that he's got us, that he's on our side, that we don't have to fear whatever happens in this life. Now, second thing, and we'll only have 2 thoughts for tonight, we'll continue this next time I preach, is that our God is a God of disputes and death. Our God is a God of disputes and death. Look at verse 13. Jesus is preaching, and he says, it says that someone in the crowd says to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now this is strange because this is not what they're talking about. If you're reading through this, they are not talking about inheritance disputes. They're not talking about solving family squabbles. This guy just interjects here with his problem in the middle of Jesus' sermon. And it's not on point, but I think for Jesus it actually is. I think the way that Jesus is talking about this, he is helping us to realize that even something as unrelated as a squabble over an inheritance is actually the same topic that he's been on. Actually, that same topic of the God of birds and bald spots is relevant here with this guy's very real life problem. So look at verse 14. He says to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Now, note, the Son of Man, which is what Jesus is, he's called that often in Luke, he's called that here in Luke 12, as the Son of Man of Daniel chapter 7. Now, we don't have time to unpack all of that, but the Son of Man has divine judicial power on earth. When it comes to anything human, he is the judge. So the correct answer to this question, who made me the judge over you, is God. That's the correct answer to this. And I think that's actually maybe the point that Jesus is getting at here. The point is that this brother, this man, has forgotten God's perspective. He's missed God's angle on what's happening in his life. So the lesson for you, if you are like me, and you have a tendency to count to the last digit and to squeeze the toothpaste tube until the very last drop is gone, and to make everything, to plan every last detail. If you have some of those tendencies within you, the lesson for you, for me, is that we can tend to operate from fear instead of faith. I think what Jesus is trying to get at is that even these mundane, real-life situations, when I think of fear, I think of life and death, skydiving, I don't know. But I think what Jesus is getting at is that fear actually governs a whole lot more of your and my life than we might like to think. That even things like that, in those moments, in the moment when, maybe this is making too much of a little thing, but in the moment when I'm squeezing the last drop out of my toothpaste tube when I could have just gotten a new one, in that moment, maybe I'm operating from a place of fear because I've forgotten, I'm blinded to the fact that God, the generous God, the relentlessly generous God that we serve, is in control of everything, that he is the creator, that he is the sustainer of our entire existence. Now, it's that blindness that this man should fear and that we should fear, not whether or not God was going to take care of him no matter what happened with his inheritance dispute. That's not what he should be afraid of. He should not be afraid of whether he would be okay. He should be afraid of the blindness that is keeping him from seeing what he's missing about God. Now look at verse 15. Jesus says to them, take care. Literally, he just says, look. So he might say, watch out and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. I don't know about you, but we could just read that phrase and just meditate on it for the next 30 minutes, and that'd be enough of a sermon for me to take home. That one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. There's more to life than digits in my bank account, than the clothes that I wear, the car that I drive, the house that I live in, whatever other status games that we dream up. There's more to life than that. And it's so easy for me, for you, to get caught up in trying to secure my life, to make sure that I am going to be okay, and to forget that that's not on me, that God's got this, that an act of faith is to let him handle that. Now, all of those thoughts lead into, here in Luke 12, what we often call the parable of the rich fool. You probably have heard this story before. And what's interesting about it is that it's not wrong to call it the parable of the rich fool, but when you read through it, it's actually not the rich fool who's the main character here. You can see that from, among other things, in verse 20, Jesus actually introduces God himself. He names God, introduces him into this parable, which is the only time that happens, specifically naming God in a parable. And I think that helps point to the fact that everything in this parable centers around God, that God is the main character here, that God is the creator of everything that's involved, the land, the grain, the human himself, that God created it all. But then also, if God's the main character, the lead supporting role is played by God's earth, because God's earth is the creative subject of this parable. You can see in verse 16, he tells them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. He had a bumper crop. Now notice, the subject of this clause, this sentence, the land produced plentifully. It's not the rich man, it's the land. Now this is the biblical language from the very beginning. From Genesis chapter 1, it talks about the land producing fruit. Genesis chapter 2, it talks about the land producing humans, that we came from dust, and to dust we shall return. So this is biblical language, it's biblical thought, that God's earth is pulsing with his creative energy, and we are inseparably connected to it, that we are just grounded in God's earth. Literally, because as soon as we jump, we're coming right back down, we're grounded here, but then also spiritually, that we are connected to our earth, that we can't separate ourselves, that we come from dust, and to dust we shall return. Now this farmer misses all of that. He presumes that he, and not God, not God's green earth, that he is the creative subject of his life. And if you look over the next 3 verses, you'll see it's all about him. He thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. I feel weird reading like this, but I hope you're getting the point. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. You see here, he's acting as if me, myself, and I, as if that's all that there is. That's his perspective here. Now, what's interesting about this to me, and challenging, is that it's easy to read a parable like this and to scapegoat him. To say, man, that farmer is so blind to how he's looking at the world. But I think if that farmer lived in Mapleville, Arkansas in 2024, I think it'd be pretty likely that he would maybe, let's just say, that he'd be in church. And if he's in church on a Sunday, you know how he's probably not talking? He's probably not saying this. But maybe outside of church, in real life, when we're not just smack dab in the middle of this with him, it's easier to live life, to make decisions as though I am the creative subject of my life, as though I am creating it all. But God says so in verse 20, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be?" Now, the same word that means soul can be translated person or inner life, life. And I think here, if we read it as life, it helps. In verse 19, life, self, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. And then God, this night, your life is required of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? This word required literally means to ask in return. It's a loan. And that's something that surely this man, the shrewd businessman that he was, understood. He understood what a loan was. But what he hadn't accounted for is the fact that his life and everything that had to do with it was on loan. He had it on loan from God and from God's earth. And that one day, in God's time, everything reverts back to its source. Now, that's something that you and I know. We know it in a biblical and theological and just church sense. We know that life is a vapor. We know that we don't own anything. So we know that. But I think we also know it deep down. I think in the moments when we allow ourselves to feel it, and maybe in the moments where we're forced to feel it by losing people that we love, that are close to us, things like that, in those moments, we experience this reality that we all can't escape from deep down inside of us. That we came from dust, and to dust we are returning. That we are here for a little while, but that everything that we have here is on loan. That all of this is not mine. It's not yours. That we're here for a little bit of time. And I think we managed to distract ourselves pretty well. We manage to distract ourselves through sports, through entertainment, through politics, this week especially, right? We manage to distract ourselves with all of these things. And maybe we ignore the fact that we are all part of the circle of life, and that a circle doesn't make exceptions. That we're all coming to an end one day. Now, this farmer had forgotten that. And that's what Jesus is calling this man with this dispute to remember. Now, if you're just reading through this, remember, this all started because this guy came up and asked about a dispute over his inheritance. And this maybe seems a little bit over the top from Jesus, right? Like this is a pretty normal thing, and all of a sudden Jesus is talking about life and death, but to Jesus it actually is that serious. In verse 21, he says, "So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So whatever status games that we come up with, it's all monopoly money. It's not actually real. We all have it on a loan, and it's going back one day. And if we can say it like this, it's going back with interest, that we are expected to have some interest. We didn't read verses 8 through about 12 or so, but Jesus says, "Whoever confesses me, I'll confess him." There are expectations of us here on earth. In the mind of Jesus, we are expected to confess him, and then he will confess us in front of his Father. So it's going back with interest. And as we close tonight, we're running out of time swiftly, but I want you to turn to Ecclesiastes. This may feel a little bit like an abrupt shift because we've been in Luke this whole time, but I want to read several verses together, so they're not going to be on the screen, from Ecclesiastes, because Ecclesiastes offers us wisdom that is really relevant to this story and to our lives. The next slide is a quote from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 15 and verse 8. Now, this is an ancient Jewish text, not actually written by Solomon, but it's called the Solomonic wisdom tradition. It's just people trying to think in the way of Solomon and write from his perspective. It says, and I think it sums up helpfully that parable. It says, "He is a human being who was himself formed from earth only a short while earlier, and after a little while, when he must return the life that was lent to him, he will go back to the same earth. He is a human being, but he wastes his labor shaping a useless god out of the same clay that he uses to make pots." Now, I wish we could dwell on that more, but I hope that gives you some perspective, as it does for me, that it's challenging. And speaking of challenging, let's read some Ecclesiastes. So let's start in chapter 2. Beginning in verse 18 of chapter 2, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. This also is empty. It doesn't make sense. Why is life like this? So I turned about and I gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of his heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. This also is empty. It doesn't make sense. It's like literally it's smoke. I grab after it, and it's there, so I should be able to grab it, but I can't because it's not actually there. That's how life is to him. It doesn't make sense. It should, but it doesn't. Now, chapter 5 of Ecclesiastes. If I keep talking about this, we're going to be here a long time. So chapter 5, there's a grievous evil that I've seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is the father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. Chapter 6, there's an evil that I have seen under the sun. It lies heavy on mankind. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires, yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This doesn't make sense. It's vanity. It's a grievous evil. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and he also has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For it comes in vanity and goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Just skipping down to this question at the end of this next sentence. Do not all go to the same place. No matter what happens on earth. You see, the Ecclesiastes writer is struggling through some existential questions. No matter what I do here on earth, it all comes to an end. It all doesn't make sense, and we all go to the same place in the end. I hope you can see some of the similarities, but also the differences between that rich farmer and this preacher, this professor of Ecclesiastes. That they're striving, they're working, they're toiling after all of these things. But the Ecclesiastes professor, the preacher, has come to this point where he doesn't know what the point of it all is. And of course, at the end, it wraps up neatly. But I want you to see, even before the end, in chapter 2, back in chapter 2, right after what we read. Because our question is like, what do we do about this? What do we do about these existential questions that we just throw up our hands and just say, whatever, I'm done, I give up on life? Or maybe we do what Luke 12's farmer does. We just choose to play the game for as long as we can, as hard as we can, as best we can. We play the game of life. We try to win, and that's what we do. I don't think either of those are the way of Jesus, and I think Ecclesiastes gives us a hint at this. Verse 24, there's nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat and who can have enjoyment? Notice, for this preacher, it's a gift from God. Everything that we have that is good, that we can hold on to, even for just a moment, is a gift from God. Also, in between what we read in chapter 5 and chapter 6, just skimming over chapter 5, verses 18 and 19, everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and accept his law and rejoice in his soul, this is the gift of God. Now, the Ecclesiastes writer is existential, he's pessimistic, but he has perspective that the farmer missed. The perspective that all of this is from God, and all of it's going back to him. That all of this is on loan. Now, I wish we could talk more about Ecclesiastes. I would read Ecclesiastes to you until it actually is midnight. But I want to end just by thinking about how, with everything that happens in life, all the, as Ecclesiastes puts it, the vanity, the ridiculousness, that it doesn't make sense, the paradoxes of our reality. that with all of that, we can choose to throw our hands up, we can choose to play the game, or we can choose joy. And in a weird way, the pessimism of Ecclesiastes, that's where it ends. He says in chapter 8, this is where I think Jesus gets the line from the farmer. He says, eat, drink, be merry. The Ecclesiastes writer says, this is a gift from God, to eat, to drink, to be merry, for whatever we can, to have fun here on earth. And that seems like a weird place to end. That's not maybe something we say a lot in church, but I think it's actually profound. It's actually a profound act of faith to choose not to get caught up in the fear, the anxiety of everything that happens. And I'm speaking to you tonight as a full-blown hypocrite, okay? Not to get caught up in all of the anxiety that I naturally get caught up in. This is the hamster wheel that happens day after day. But that we can choose joy. That we can choose to be human-sized, not try to be God-sized. That we can choose to sit in the fact that these little human-sized hands don't have control over what happens. That I can choose to have faith. I can choose to enjoy the gifts that God has given us in this life. That we can eat, drink, be merry. For tomorrow, hopefully not literally, but at some point, we will die. I hope that's not as depressing as maybe it sounds on the surface, because I think it's actually really profound and really inspiring that one day, of course, all of this is coming to an end. From dust we come, from dust we return. But that can give us perspective for the days that we are here, for the days that we're here, from the moment we're born to the moment we pass from this life, that we can choose faith, we can choose joy, we can choose to let go, but also to fear and not to fear. Tonight, if you have something that you need to make right before all of us, that you want to confess or you want to ask for prayers, won't you do it as we stand and sing together?